Hi, Paul. It's Talia. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Talia.
Hi. We may have lost some people. Sorry about that. That was weird. But should we start now or wait a few minutes?
We can start now. I think Ashley was going to maybe make an introduction, and then we could get going.
Ashley is on a call figuring something out, so I'll make an introduction for you.
Okay.
So we thought we are the Holistic Healer Collective, and we have put together a series of online sessions around healing and the planet at this time and how as a species we can work together. And Paul is someone that I met not too, a short time ago, but I feel very kindred to him. And he's leading a movement around psychedelics, microdosing, and human self-actualization. And it's perfect for these days, especially with coronavirus and issues of immunology. So Paul is here to tell us more about that.
Cool. Thank you, Talia. And I think more than anything, I'm not going to sit up here and talk because I think there's like seven of us. So I would consider this more an opportunity to like ask questions. And those questions could be about microdosing. Those questions could be about, as we're in quarantine for the foreseeable future, hard to say how long, what it looks like to incorporate a plant medicine practice into our routine, whether that's microdosing or maybe higher doses with mushrooms or other plant medicines. How I'm happy to answer questions on how psychedelics relate to immunology. So as
I think it's safe to say that
so as we're learning from research on psychedelics, they can help with immunity and immune function. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about that, and then just give any sort of tips or advice or thoughts on staying healthy, staying sane, staying regulated, because all of us, I assume, are we have either friends or family members who will be impacted by COVID-19, even if we aren't directly impacted by it. So just what's a process, what's a practice to be able to stay regulated and grounded, even when it seems like the world is falling apart a little bit, because it sort of is. So I'm just here to offer insight and help on that. So most of you, from what I can tell, are muted at this point in time. There are a few of you that are unmuted. I'll ask you to keep yourself muted just throughout the session. And then with any questions, just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question. And you can just speak up through the Zoom platform and say it, or you're also free to write in the chat box. So here's the chat box. If you want to just write a question that I can answer for any of you about, again, psychedelics, microdosing, immunology, staying in a regulated parasympathetic state, anything like this, I'm happy to go into. Who wants to start? I know, Talia, do you have any questions?
I think it'd be great to start with sort of your background, how you came to this, and how microdosing has helped you on a personal level, the improvements that you've seen with yourself, and then how you've gotten interested in, bringing this to the world. Because obviously it's worked so well for you. You're now, this is your life's mission.
Yeah, so a brief backstory. Thank you, Ashley. Great question. A brief backstory about who I am. So I'm 29 now. About 10 years ago, I did LSD and psilocybin mushrooms for the first time at much higher doses in where I grew up in Michigan, kind of outside hiking with friends. And after those experiences, noticed that I made much better decisions for the week or 2 weeks after those high dose experiences. So I ate healthier, I exercised more, I was more disciplined when it came to the schoolwork that I was doing. It was just this concept of self-love was easier. It was easier to nourish myself and take really good care of myself in that process. And through taking good care of myself, I was more present with other people. It was easier for me to connect, to relate, to not be so in my head and be more out and in dialogue. And so I had those early experiences. They were super helpful and informative. But at that time, I didn't know a lot about psychedelics. I assumed what I was doing was unhealthy for me. I assumed because psychedelics were illegal that I was harming myself in some ways. And it was just nice that, the feelings that were coming were just nice, but I was sort of at this paradox of this feels really good. I'm making much better decisions. I'm getting clarity about where I'm going. And the government or the authority figures who I deem to have expertise are telling me that this is really bad for me. So I was sort of stuck at a crossroads. About 5 years later, I was living in Thailand, bootstrapping my first business, and noticed that a guy named Tim Ferriss, who wrote a book called The 4 Hour Workweek, has a big podcast. He was starting to publish information about psychedelics. And so I was 24 at the time. I looked back into it and I was like, holy shit, there's so much research and information about psychedelics that just isn't publicly known. So I ended up reading 15 or 20 books, going through a lot of clinical papers, trying to understand like how psychedelics can help with health and well-being, with health and wellness, and just started to understand like, wow, there's so much research on how it helps with alcoholism and PTSD and addiction and depression and you name it. You name it, psychedelics were seeming to help with it. So I just started to work with microdosing. I started to dig into more like about how it could be integrated into my lifestyle as part of a ritual and a routine, just like I integrate meditation or yoga or fasting or sometimes a ketogenic diet or, CrossFit, functional fitness, anything. I was like, psychedelics are just another tool in the toolkit of feeling healthy and well and vibrant and alive. And so then that informed starting Third Wave, which is an educational platform, so more people could recognize that these are really beneficial substances. And a lot of the stigma is unnecessary, it's not needed. And also I started a psilocybin retreat center in the Netherlands called Synthesis. Because psilocybin is legal there, we could do legal retreats with people. And so we facilitated retreats for almost 1,000 people at this point at Synthesis. We reach about 500,000 people every month through Third Wave with our educational content. We have a podcast, about 80 podcasts that we publish. And I speak about this topic largely from a business and tech perspective, how psychedelics can help with leadership and creativity, but also from a wellness perspective, just because it's been part of my journey. So that's some context. I'm happy to go further into that based on any questions that all of you have about that focus. And many of you are muted, so you'll have to unmute yourself to ask any questions. Any questions? I mean, if there aren't any questions.
Hey, Paul.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Fellow, you would say, psychonaut, exploring, going deeper into taking much more higher substances in some of these substances in the past, then slowly trickling off and finding more studies in the microdosing area. I've been following your stuff for a few years. What have the studies been saying, though, in comparison to having those heroic dose trips to doing those maybe gradual over time microdosing trips, or I don't know what you would call those scenarios, but what have been the difference between the two? And some people have such more profound movements on one big one or one big experience to them gradual over time. So what's the difference? What has some of the studies been showing?
Yeah, great question. So what's the difference in the research between high doses of psychedelics and microdoses of psychedelics, right?
Over a long period of time as well. Like, has there been a difference? Oh, we should be taking these over a long period of time, or is it just, hey, once a year, every 6 months kind of thing?
Great question. So the analogy, I'll first start with an analogy, and then I'll go into what we know from a research perspective. So from an analogy perspective, think of like going to the dentist. And maybe you've heard me talk about this before, Brandon, I'm not sure. But like every 6 months, we go to the dentist, we get a deep clean, we do everything we need to do from a hygienic perspective to just get that super clean. And then every day, twice a day at home, we floss, we brush our teeth, we use mouthwash, right? So from an analogy perspective, the high dose, the peak experience, the sort of the big opening, that's like going to the dentist every so often. We don't do that consistently, but it's every so often. And microdosing, or a practice like yoga or meditation, is like the practice every day of flossing and brushing your teeth to stay regulated, to stay in a parasympathetic state, to stay grounded and rooted and healthy. Now, when we look at research, we have a lot of research showing that occasional high-dose psychedelic use is perfectly healthy and fine. So we have research dating back from the 1950s, so over 70 years, showing people who even did psychedelics for many, 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 many years, high doses, occasional. There's been no heart issues. There's been no central nervous system issues. There's been no physical issues with that. There are some mental and emotional issues, but that's largely contained to people who are predisposed to psychosis and schizophrenia. In terms of microdosing is fairly new. So microdosing came about in 2011 in a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, which is a great introduction to psychedelics. And in that book, Jim Fadiman wrote a chapter on microdosing, and that's when it started to take off. So this has only been around for about 8 years. A lot of the research that's been done so far has been surveys. And in some of the clinical research, it's been shown that like microdosing helps with depression, microdosing helps with mood, microdosing helps with energetic levels, but there's no conclusive data or research showing long-term efficacy yet. In terms of if you were to microdose over a span of 5 years, what would the result of that be? So for that reason, when I talk about microdosing, my preference, the way that I started microdosing was with LSD. I microdosed LSD for twice a week for about 7 months. This is back in 2015. And what I've noticed is a lot of people who are coming to microdosing are doing so because they're transitioning off of conventional pharmaceuticals, right? And LSD is it's more of a mimic to conventional pharmaceuticals because it's a semi-synthetic. But the goal, I think, for many people is how do you start a practice with plant medicine, psilocybin mushrooms in particular, because that's much more sustainable and healthy in the long term. It's better, in particular, when we're talking about immunology in the time of COVID-19, psilocybin is highly anti-inflammatory. And we know that inflammation is a significant factor in how well our immune system is doing. And we can look at inflammation in two ways. We look at chronic inflammation and we look at acute inflammation. Chronic inflammation is tied to the lifestyle choices that we make. It's tied to our diet, it's tied to our sleep patterns, it's tied to our exercise, it's tied to how much sun we get, it's tied to our meditation practice, how we stay in a parasympathetic state. And the goal is always keep chronic inflammation as low as possible. And you can keep chronic inflammation as low as possible through, number one, great sleep, 7 to 8 hours of sleep every night. I wear an Oura ring, O-U-R-A, which I will type in, which is fantastic. It's a thing that helps you to track your REM sleep, your deep sleep, your heart rate variability, all these things, which helps you to understand patterns for your sleep patterns. The other thing that helps is a low inflammation diet. So it's important to know that a ketogenic diet is very healthy for inflammation. Fasting, I'm only going to speak for men at this point. Fasting for men is really good for inflammation. Women, it's a bit of a different thing because there's a hormonal difference between men and women. The other things to keep in mind are like vegetable oils are going to be bad for chronic inflammation. So oat milk, for example, is largely vegetable oil, rapeseed oil. You'll see as the main ingredient that's highly inflammatory that will lead to chronic inflammation, as will various other, like eating unrefined grains, eating various other things that are just leading to chronic inflammation. We want to keep that as low as possible. Microdosing helps lowering chronic inflammation. High doses help with lowering chronic inflammation. And that helps us to stay in a parasympathetic state, which is a regulated, emotionally in tune state. Now, there's also acute inflammation. Acute inflammation is when you cut yourself, and then there needs to be something that helps to heal that. That's acute inflammation. So essentially what you want to do is COVID-19, something like a virus, that's when your body needs to respond with an acute inflammatory response to defeat it and destroy it. And it can only respond with an acute inflammatory response if your chronic inflammation is really, really low. Because then it has the energy and the ability to go in and attack it and kill it and eliminate it as fast as possible. So for thinking about viruses, for thinking about colds, for thinking about any time you get sick, the lower you keep your chronic inflammation through great sleep, through a healthy diet, that's a low inflammatory diet, through exercise, through sunlight and vitamin D, through meditation, through microdosing, then any acute inflammatory response, you're going to kill that right away. It's going to be much easier to address it and attack it. So I think, that's a little bit going deeper into your question, Brandon.
have no problem keeping it going. What are some of these things that, like, variables that when you guys do these studies or experiments, like what controls are you going after, to come after these things when you're giving people microdoses or macro dose things in these experiments?
So I'm not a researcher. So,
Okay.
we do some survey-based research through Third Wave. I've helped with other research projects. Usually they'll do it in terms of a placebo-controlled person. So they'll have people who are microdosing, they'll have people who aren't microdosing, and then they'll compare the two, and they'll usually give a placebo to the randomized control trial. So that's partly some. Others is just a lot of survey-based research right now. Because psychedelics are illegal, it's prohibitively expensive to do research. So that's also been one of the issues with getting more and more information and data out about microdosing, about high doses, is its funding is the core issue. Anyone else? Brandon, I'll come back to you. I want to see if anyone else has any other questions that are popping up here as we're talking about these topics.
Pam.
Did Pam want to say something? Pam, do you want to say something? Ask something? No?
Oh, does somebody want me to say something? It's Pam. My cat.
I didn't know if you had a question. That's all.
Oh, let's see. The only kind of things I think about is when I actually did psychedelics in the 70s. Like they were pretty good, I should have to say. And it was both LSD and mushrooms. And it's kind of like back then, like I'm in my 60s. So back then, when I did those, then it really changed how I look at the world and myself and others. I mean, probably for the rest of my life. So when I microdosed a couple weeks ago, I just wanted to see what it was, what it was like again, 40 years later, 50 years, 40 years later. And it kind of was just kind of the same. It's kind of like I felt like I did it then, and I did it in a pretty interesting way with friends and nature and that kind of thing. It wasn't like a party with Boone's Farm wine or anything. It was actually, we did it and we would talk and we would go through our journeys or whatever you call them. And it changed me. And I mean, at this point, I'm a therapist now. At this point, I wanted to see how this can be used for clients, that kind of thing. I'm not going to be doing that with clients, but I want to understand what their options are in regulating. You talked about self-regulation, regulating themselves and just getting to where they want to be. So that's kind of why I tried it a couple of weeks ago. So that's just kind of what I'm thinking about right now as you're talking.
Cool. I love that. I'll go a little, so I can talk a little bit about like psychedelic therapy. How's that?
Okay, good.
In terms of the research, in terms of what's been going on. Talia's so cute.
Thanks,
so psychedelic therapy, there's been, I would say, three main research trials that have been going on in the United States for the efficacy of psychedelic therapy. And this is all at higher doses at this point in time. So one is MDMA, also called Molly, the pure form of MDMA for PTSD. So what's great about MDMA is when it's used within a therapeutic context, it helps people feel very, very, very safe. So when it's used in conjunction with psychotherapy, essentially PTSD is an acute trauma, usually emotional trauma. And so it's difficult for people when they have that acute emotional trauma to go back and to recall it, specifically because they have a fear response. Their amygdala tightens up and they just can't do it without becoming overwhelmed. So essentially what MDMA does is it allows the amygdala to loosen and allows people to go back into their emotional psyche history, like war veterans or sexual assault survivors, and it allows them to process that trauma, to act as a catharsis, and then be able to integrate it. so that they can heal from PTSD. So they've done clinical research with MDMA for PTSD, and 70% of people healed and cured their PTSD after about the initial 12-week session with, I think, 3 MDMA sessions, and then checking in over a year later, 70% have been cured from PTSD, which is about 2 to 3 times about 3 to 4 times better than traditional ways of healing PTSD. So that's one kind of psychedelic therapy element to be aware of. The other is psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms. Psilocybin has been used for alcoholism and end-of-life anxiety and treatment-resistant depression. And psilocybin is a little bit different than MDMA. MDMA allows the catharsis, allows the ability to process emotional trauma. Psilocybin is better for the mystical experience, for the peak experience, for the opening, where basically you become one with whatever it is that is around you, this unitive mystical experience. And from that insight, you then can go, oh, death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is just, it's passing beyond the veil. It's passing with what's next, which I think is really important to keep in mind, especially with COVID-19. We're going to be seeing a lot of death in the coming months, significant death in the coming year and a half, I would say, because of COVID-19, but more because of the second and third order consequences, that there could be potentially massive civil unrest, massive unemployment. Could be a failure of state governments. So I think also this sense of how do we come to terms with death as a culture, particularly in American culture, which has kept this repressed for so long. We just don't talk about it here. We put our old people in nursing homes and we just say, we don't want to, get away. So there's also that process culturally. How do we come to terms with death? How do we come to terms with the ending of life? And psychedelics, high doses in particular, can also help with that. And then when that fear is overcome, then people notice it's much easier to make choices and decisions that align with their sense of self, with their secure, grounded, rooted sense of self. So, that could just be making better lifestyle decisions, like the food that we eat and kind of what we put into our bodies and how we exercise and treat ourselves. It could be, oftentimes it's relationships in our life. So cutting off toxic relationships, cutting off relationships that are taking energy from us, that don't serve us to some capacity. So that's also what a lot of people have insight on. And then it's a lot of spiritual stuff. I think the larger crisis that we've been going through as a culture is existential in nature. Well, why do we live? What's the purpose, right? For many years, especially in the States and other Western countries, Christianity provided that structure in terms of, this is why we live. This is our purpose. It's to serve God. It's to be a disciple of Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. And what a lot of people are realizing is they're kind of going into atheism from that. And what psychedelics are helping to do is helping to bring back, I would say, a more maybe developed approach to a spiritual practice, where there's an understanding of these religions and the parables that come from Christianity and Buddhism and Islam and all the major world religions. And then there's also a sense of the subjective spiritual experience. What do I believe? What's important to me? Why am I here? And I think, and psychedelics are just helping to provide insights for that individual awakening that a lot of people are starting
Hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what I'm hearing is there's this convergence of psychology. I think cognitive behavioral therapy can only take people so far. And then this is a truly experiential that people can go through it's not like the therapy they're doing isn't good or doesn't further them along on their path, but this is almost an adjunct or a next step. And what I like, everything I've heard you say, it's like sounds like years of what I've studied with neuropsychology and all the different modalities that I've learned through the years. And all I know is what I'm hearing from you is you're reading the right things, you're experiencing the right things. You're talking to me like how my colleagues that have PhDs in psychology talk. So I'm really appreciative. So thank you.
Thank you. And it's funny, there was just an article that popped up in Aeon, which I'm happy to share after this, and it talked about exactly this, the limitations of CBT, cognitive
Yeah.
behavioral therapy,
Right.
and why depth therapy is so useful and necessary. So more therapy that's rooted in Jungian psychology rather than maybe a more, Freudian approach or whatever else.
Yeah. Yeah. Freud was right about a few things. He's really the one that started things, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, we've come a long way from then. And I do like what you're talking about, like what this COVID-19 is bringing up for everybody is the bottom line, which is death and facing our own death, which is at the base of everything. It's the base of most of our fears.
Mortality. And it's things get very honest is what I've noticed. You like
Yes.
it's like, I'll give an example. I was living in Oakland for the last 9 months, and I moved there in May, and was like, is this really the place I want to ride out of quarantine? And I made the decision to pack up all my things within 24 hours and book a flight to Miami, because I have a close friend here who we could get a place together, and someone who I'm romantically interested in. So it was like, that's where I want my energy to be. It was either there or my parents' basement in Michigan. It was like, I'm not doing that. So I think we get very honest. And I've noticed this with business partners in the last week or two, like there's a lot of triggers coming up. And so I think that's another thing to be aware of for any, other therapists, or like, now is not a good time to take things personal for any of us, like there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of triggers, there's a lot of attachment wounds, there's a lot of things that are going to be coming up into the collective and into our families. And that's where it's so useful to go, well, how can I stay grounded in my practice so I can just help to be kind of like absorb and mirror some of these things as a way to help my family and friends and loved ones to continue to grow and develop in their own process.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I feel like I'm talking too much. I'm going to quit talking now, but thank you for everything you said. You're very, I'm very inspired by you this morning.
Thank you, Pam. I appreciate it.
Welcome.
All right. Ashley had asked a couple kind of base level questions. Any other questions that are popping up? I want to make sure we can keep this as spontaneous as possible.
Yeah, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
So over the last, I would say 20 years or so, I've had many different psychedelic journeys that have been all amazing in different ways, but I've never experienced with microdosing. And so I guess my question is, from a more like practical standpoint, what does a typical microdosing protocol look like? And then also, aside from the sort of like anti-inflammatory effects and other things that you see from sort of a physiological perspective, what are kind of the benefits you get from maybe an emotional perspective or creative perspective or things like that?
Great. And what's your name?
My name's Chris.
Chris. Great. Thanks, Chris, for the question. Sure. So I'll preface this with saying, go to Third Wave after this. thethirdwave.co is the website. thethirdwave.co. We have microdosing guides and information. So anything I mentioned today, you'll be able to find there. We also have a course with a community of people who you can connect with and talk to about this. So there's lots of support. Microdosing is, the basics of it is you're taking about 1/10 of a regular dose. So if a regular dose of LSD is 100 micrograms, with LSD microdose, you're taking 10 micrograms. If a regular dose of psilocybin mushrooms is, let's say, 2 to 3 grams, a microdose is 0.2 to 0.3 grams. And the idea is you do that 2 or 3 times a week, and you go and you basically observe and pay attention to how does your baseline change from day 1 to day 30. So we know for a high dose experience, there's going to be a significant change from day 1 to day 2, because you're having that peak experience, that opening. With microdosing, we're more look at how is microdosing helping us on an ongoing basis from day 1 to day 30, doing it 2 or 3 times a week. So there are, I would say, 3 things to pay attention to in that process and to observe. One is your physical well-being. How's your sleep? And I mentioned this earlier, but the Oura Ring is great to track and measure sleep. How is your diet? How are you eating? Are you making better food decisions? Are you making better exercise decisions? So that's one thing, physical. The next thing is what I would call mental. How is your cognitive function? Are you focused? Can you stay present with the work that you're doing? How is your creativity, right? And usually what microdosing does is it helps with creativity, it helps with focus, it helps with a concept called flow. So flow is this idea of being in the zone. You're really in the zone and you can just sort of with the work that you're doing. And microdosing can help with facilitating that flow state. So that's the mental part. And then there's the emotional part. And the emotional part is really tied to presence. Just like mindfulness meditation or yoga or breath work is helping us to facilitate presence. Yeah, I like that, Ashley. So it's helping us to facilitate more presence. When we're more present, we're more regulated. We're in a more of a parasympathetic state. We can make better choices and decisions because we're in a parasympathetic state. We're not just reacting to things, but we're responding with our whole sense of self to whatever it is that's calling us. And then because it helps with presence, then when we're more present, the ego is less likely to flare up in reaction. So the ego can stay grounded and rooted, meaning it's more adaptable. You become more adaptable, you become more open, you become more willing to make new choices and decisions because they're not threatening some wounded part of you. Through that emotional processing, that wounded part of you is continuing to be integrated more and more on an ongoing basis. So yeah, I would say that's kind of a basic gist or overview of microdosing.
That's super helpful. Thank you for that. One follow-up question I have is whether or not you or anybody you know has experienced or experimented with microdosing and exercise, and what sort of the outcome of that is.
So when I have, so count me in for that. When I first started microdosing, I was living in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And so I was living in Chiang Mai, I was microdosing, and I would go to CrossFit pretty consistently. At that point, I was doing CrossFit. And what I noticed is there's just a better sense of coordination, right? You're more in tune with your body. There's a better sense of coordination. You also have more energy because LSD is dopaminergic. It helps to facilitate more energy, just like coffee does. So LSD, microdosing LSD, I sort of joke, but it's like a psychedelic coffee, essentially, because you're having more of the stimulation, more of the focus and sort of convergent thinking, but with that sort of creative flair that comes with LSD as a psychedelic. There's also a couple resources about extreme sport athletes who have been microdosing since the 70s. So this has always been their sort of like, don't tell anyone this, but this is what we're doing to have better coordination, whether it's snowboarders or skiers or you name it. There's an entire article in the MAPS Bulletin. I think 2013, a guy named James Orrick wrote a piece about this and talked about extreme sport athletes who were like microdosing and how is their sort of secret thing. So that would be another cool thing to look in. But yeah, definitely what I would recommend would be, before you do that, first create a relationship with it. So have an idea of how it's impacting you. What's an appropriate level? What's too high? What's too low? What's sort of your middle ground? And I would say do that microdosing at home. Well, obviously that's a great thing. We're all at home now, so microdosing becomes a little bit easier. And then as you start to go, oh yeah, I can do that. Then go for a run or go for a walk or do some sprints or lift some weights or whatever it is that you want to however you exercise.
Cool, thanks.
For sure. I like that, Talia. So what's the relationship between us as a mycelium network and microdosing and psychedelics? So a mycelium network is what connects mushrooms. So we see the mushrooms and the spores that are all up above the grass, but below is a vast mycelium network that's connecting mushrooms across huge swaths of distance. So there's this fantastic film, which I know Talia is well aware of, and maybe many of you are as well, called Fantastic Fungi. And Fantastic Fungi explains this really well. So mycelial networks are decentralized. If you kill part of a mycelial network, all the other parts will survive. So it's very anti-fragile and adaptable. It grows from chaos. And essentially what psychedelics are helping us to do are become like those mycelial networks. So we're looking at things like how decentralization is becoming more and more common, how peer-to-peer currency like Bitcoin, right? That sense of a mycelial network. There's not a top-down structure, right? Industrial era organizations, industrial era ways of being are top-down, right? That's capitalism. essentially, because that top-down model helped with getting resources into the hands that needed to be had. And what we're going to see with a shift with COVID in particular is the adoption of more and more decentralized networks. Because as we're seeing, centralized networks like the United States federal government with a highly incompetent president cannot respond to crisis like this. It's slow, it takes way too long, there's not near enough resources, our healthcare systems will likely fail, we don't have enough ventilators, there's the second order consequences of the economy, of greater income inequality, of greater poverty, right? All of these are failures on behalf of the system. And that's because the system that we have is fragile. If there's something called a black swan event, which is a totally unknown event, it's like, where the fuck did that come from? A black swan event will break fragile systems, right? That's what we have. We have a system that is fragile, and that's why a lot of it is breaking. And what we need to build as communities, as individuals, in relations with our family, in relations in the businesses and the organizations that we create, are anti-fragile systems. So anti-fragile systems, you have fragile, which just break from chaos and disruption, like we're seeing right now with COVID-19. We have a fragile system. You have resilient systems, which just go, they don't break, but they don't get stronger. So this is South Korea. This is Taiwan. These are governments that have responded to this crisis and have kept most people safe and healthy, but they're still not able to adapt as quick as they need to. And then there's anti-fragile systems. And anti-fragile systems are, oh, there's something that happens, a black swan, a disruption, and then that system grows and becomes stronger and more resilient and more capable to handle future chaos like climate change and major income inequality. And so what we need to do is we need to create more anti-fragile systems. There's a writer, Nassim Taleb, who has written a lot about this. That's a bit more theoretical. I think on the ground, how that shows up for us in terms of being more anti-fragile and being more adaptable is, again, not taking things personal. Right? So how can we act as, like, this is the fundamental core of good therapy. How can I, as a person, hold space for others in my life? And in holding that space, how can I act as a mirror and not project my own wounding into that space? And so psychedelics help with that process of holding space, of being open, of being, adaptable, of not taking things personal. And then if there's feedback, if there's criticism, if there's like, oh, I should make this change because making this change serves my higher self. It serves my stronger sense of self, my more healthy and secure sense of self, then it's just like, yeah, I can make that change because that behavior, that part of me, it's not actually part of me. It's a story that I took on. It's an expectation that I took on. And a big part of, again, what COVID is bringing up is what stories aren't yours? What beliefs have you taken on that aren't yours? And how can you really come in this time of internal reflection, of self-awareness, of really dropping in with yourself? How can we start to make choices and decisions that are fully ours and that come from our
can't hear you. I'm listening to something.
Hold on a minute.
Someone is on their iPhone and needs to mute it. Thank you. Yes.
I got it. I had to do a little bit of searching. Find it. Cool. Resilient versus anti-fragile. Yeah, Ashley. And this is going to become big. It will become very, very much more common because anti-fragility is how we deal with systemic risk. And we're at a point where we're facing incredible systemic risk because all of the infrastructure that we've built is not useful for dealing with situations like this. So that's enough of that. I have 5 minutes until 1, and then I have to go. So are there any kind of final wrap-up questions that we want to get into for today? And like, I'm happy to do another one of this. We can probably set up another call deeper into some things around psychedelics. We just had some technical issues with Facebook Live, so that it was just a bit challenging.
Oh, yes, thank you.
I used it. Thank
you,
Pam. You guys recommend 3 times a week.
And I didn't know I wasn't on.
Is there a length of time that baseline should continue for, the 3 times a week? Like, let's say 3 times a week for 3 months, 6 months, or is this just like a consistent, always on thing that you emerge into?
If you've never microdosed before, I would say start doing it for just a month, right? 2 to 3 times a week for a month, and see how your baseline changes. So journal, have some sort of practice of self-reflection where you can just go, oh, I was here for day 1 and now I'm here in day 30. I'm eating healthier, I'm exercising more, whatever it is, right? Have that mindfulness to know, how does my baseline change? And then once you know how your baseline changes, then once you know your baseline changes, then you go, oh, so this has been useful. And this has been useful because I was doing X, Y, and Z as a result of microdosing. So then it's up to you from an intuition perspective. Do I keep microdosing or do I move to something else? And what I would highly recommend anyone doing, if you still have maybe significant trauma that's still not dealt with, if you struggle with depression or anxiety or PTSD or anything like that, I would say that first month, get a therapist who's there for you with that first month to help. Because to be honest, for some people, the first month is great. Everything feels great. But for others, there's going to be things that need to be processed and that will come up. And so having a therapist to talk about some of maybe the anxiety or some of the challenges that you're facing as you're starting to microdose, as you're becoming more aware of who you are, right? Like having a therapist to talk to is going to be great for that. So what we're going to do is with Third Wave, and Talia, more details later, but I think doing another thing for this is we're now bringing on therapists for Third Wave who you can talk to as you microdose for a month from a telehealth perspective. So you'll have a qualified psychedelic therapist who essentially, if you want to microdose at home and you want someone who can be there with you during the duration of that, then we'll provide support for that process.
Fantastic. Any more 2-minute answers? Any questions anyone has?
No, but what it brings up for me is that there's so much more to talk about with this.
There is.
Yeah, and that definitely you should come back.
Let's set up another time. I'll coordinate with Talia and Ashley, and we can maybe even send out like an invite for people to sign up.
Yeah.
And that way we could do like a webinar about it. And that way people can come and I can answer more questions, and I'll come. Like he was here to answer questions, but I can prepare a little something, and we could work on putting a webinar together about this, because I think it would be very useful for a lot of people right now.
Well, the other thing is I'm on 2 huge listservs with therapists that are asking for speakers for our symposium, which can't happen now in May, and that you could do some kind of a webinar where you get paid, or there's some kind of a fee where you would get paid.
I would love that. Let's try to set that up, because I think we're going to do some similar stuff with Third Wave webinars and all that stuff. So I would love that, Pam. That would be great.
All right, so what I can do is I can connect with somebody on this listserv and see if there's interest there, and then get your information and then pass it on.
Okay, that's great. And Talia, I'll connect with Talia as well, and Ashley. Thank you everyone for attending, for being here, for asking questions. And we recorded this, so I'm going to send the recording to Talia and Ashley after, if you want to review and kind of go through some of that. And then I'll look forward to seeing you all hopefully on the next one, or another conference, virtual conference.
All right, stay well.
Thank you, Paul.
You too. All of you stay well, stay healthy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.